Welcome to the Aspects of History podcast with me, your host, Nathen Amin. Charlie Higson, a bona fide Renaissance man of entertainment. I think it's fair to say you've been successful in the fields of music, as a lead singer of your own band, comedy, of course, which is where many of us will know you from. You're back on stage with your fast show colleagues, dramatic actor. You've done radio, a hugely successful novel series, podcasting, of course, and now you've added historian to your litany of achievements. I think you would have done very well, in fact, at the early Tudor court. Henry VII always valued men of culture and learning, though things might get a bit trickier during the reign of Henry VIII when he executed a few of his musicians.
Yes. Well, I couldn't do with reading all that Latin, and also reading those. I mean, you look at those old texts, or whatever you want to call them, all those handwritten things, and a very dense sort of. Do we call it Gothic script? Whatever it is, but really hard to read. But I'm always sort of hats off to proper historians who do go back and look at original sources and learn how to read this stuff and understand it. I suppose it's just what you're used to. But yes, I'm probably more a jack of all trades than a proper Renaissance man.
Do you think you would have liked to have lived during the Tudor period? Would that have been your bag?
It's fascinating, isn't it, thinking about the past and whether what the reality of it really would have been. I mean, God, any historian, well, not just historians, I think most people just do think, wouldn't it be amazing to go back there and see it all? I mean, the Tudor court was a pretty dangerous place to be. It seemed to be very few people made it out alive.
I mean, I think if you were to go back, I would like to take some cocodamol, perhaps, because they didn't have the best pain relief. But I guess that's not going to protect you against Henry VIII, is it? When you're on a chopping block, popping a few cocodamols is not going to do the trick.
I don't think a couple of painkillers are going to really make the rack experience any more pleasant.
Okay, so I mean, we could talk for hours really about the many lives that you've lived, but this is a history podcast, so we should focus on, I suppose,
yes,
what I think is probably something of a labour of love for you in recent times. Your podcast, Willie, Harry, Stee, and the companion book that has recently been published.
Yes.
So I guess first and foremost, I mean, tell me how this podcast came into being.
Yes, well, I'll just put my historian hat on now, or it's probably a crown, actually. I did buy one. I have got a plastic crown and a red robe to do all the blooming social media that you have to do these days. But, it all started with the podcast. But that... The roots of that really are that I have been a regular, what do you call it? Well, not historian, but I've given regular talks at the Chalk History Festival almost since it started. I didn't do the first two. I was drafted in to do they do a big a sort of comedy history quiz, a sort of have I got medieval news for you, as it were, and they wanted a host. And so they asked me, and they said, well, while you're there, Charlie, can you give a talk of some kind of vaguely historical nature? So I've given vaguely historical talks ever since, and I've really enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed meeting the historians and being part of that world. And then, well, during lockdown, I was reminded of the Willie, Harry, Stee rhyme. For those who don't know, it's a way of remembering all the monarchs from William the Conqueror to the present day. Willie being William the Conqueror. Willie, Harry, Stee, Harry, Dick, John, Harry, 3, 1, 2, 3 Neds, Richard 2, etc. And I sort of relearnt the rhyme, which I'd learnt at school in the 60s. And then I thought, well, I really want to know who all these people are. It was a good way of keeping myself occupied during lockdown. And so I set about finding out a little bit about each of them. And I thought, you know what, that would make a very good narrative podcast. You start with Willie and you work your way through, which I've done. But having enjoyed doing it, I've expanded that now into looking at still trying to keep it narrative. I like telling the stories of that. And then, of course, a publisher got in touch and said, did I think the podcast would make a good book? And I said, yes, I did. And yes, the rest is history.
Which we don't promote alternative history podcasts on here, thank you. I mean, you've touched on something very interesting there, in that you view yourself as a storyteller,
Yes.
Rather than a historian. For my money, I think some of the best historians are storytellers. I mean, that is essentially what the discipline of history is. We are telling a story. And I know for my money, when I am producing my own talks in public, I'm taking inspiration from stand-up comedy. I'm taking inspiration from acting. I am giving a performance, and you do learn some of the skills from storytellers, and I think vice versa. So, I think you being a natural storyteller is very good when you're able to apply that to the history world, and you've obviously proven quite successful in that. You've collaborated with many great historians. People like Helen Castor, who I know we both admire, Tom Holland.
I mean, it's interesting, the thing about narrative history, but because for a long while it was out of fashion. I mean, I mentioned that I learnt the Willie, Harry, Stee rhyme at school, and I was probably the last generation of school kids that was routinely taught a narrative version of history. And it was a very narrow version of history as well. It was very much British history and the history of the empire and all of that sort of stuff. Kings and queens, great men and women, big battles, that sort of thing. And it fell out of favour. The 60s and into the 70s, with things like the sort of Marxist approach to history, or saying, well, it's not about individuals, it's about big movements, and it's about epochs and eras in history, and we shouldn't be distracted by the colourful stories of Henry VIII and Simon de Montfort or whoever. And I think it's swung to, and that is very valid. That is also a very valid way of looking at history, but it's perhaps not as gripping for the sort of ordinary man or woman in the street who I'm kind of writing for. But in the last few years, writers, well, like you mentioned, Helen Castor, Tom Holland, obviously, have sort of helped swing things back towards narrative history, and I think you need to get a balance, because it is the best way of getting information across, and for information to stick if you remember it as a story. But of course, that's also open to abuse, because you can make up your own stories, and who's to know if you're telling the truth?
Yeah, because I think we live in quite interesting times. Because when I first came into this,
that's an understatement.
With regards to the history, at least,
history.
The past. It's been very interesting, because there seemed to be this schism almost between academia and people producing public history, and I found that quite difficult to navigate, because I am a public historian. I'm not an academic. I don't come from academia, and there was something of imposter syndrome in how I was trying to portray and present my history. And I went to a talk where Greg Jenner was presented. And Greg Jenner is an incredible historian who's done some fantastic work in essentially public outreach.
Yeah.
And he explained what the role of a public historian is. And it is to try and capture the imaginations of the general public through narrative storytelling. And if you can get them interested in history, and they can then delve deeper into the subject, there is a whole world of academic resource out there.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what podcasting, what we are doing, narrative writing, it is all very valid. Because nobody comes to history straight into an academic thesis. They need something that pulls them in and interests them. And today we have all the different mediums in the world to try and get that out there. I mean, TikTok and Instagram Reels are the latest big thing. That's passed me by, I'm afraid, but the technology is there.
Yes, if you know how to use it. Well, I mean, there has been that debate between, academia and popular historians, and obviously, if I'm any kind of historian, it is a popular historian. And some academics are quite scathing about popular history, and they're quite scathing about history festivals that have reenactors there. But there is room for all sorts, and I rely very heavily on all the work that the academic historians have done, putting this stuff together. But as a raw source, you've got to be very interested in the subject to get into the academic books. But it is obviously a great source for the likes of me to use. And what's quite interesting, actually, because on my podcast, the format is that when I was just doing the monarchs, I would give my take on the monarch from what I had researched and found out about them for about half an hour and say, that's the story. And then I would have a proper historian on, such as yourself, who would, who would really spend a lifetime looking into this stuff. And they would then give me their version of it, and I would ask them all the questions that I wanted to ask about them. And often, they would point out things that I'd got wrong or misunderstood. And I think that balance is pretty good. And I've had popular historians on, I've had more serious historians. Well, not that popular historians aren't serious, but you know what I mean, more serious historians. And I have had academics on from universities. And what's quite interesting is they say, well, actually, we are encouraged to do this sort of thing now because our work is all about outreach, if you want, for want of a better word. It is about trying to publicise what we're doing. And, they can talk about the courses that they teach at the universities. And for those people who are interested in histories, it can be very inspiring for them to think, oh, yeah, I'd like to go down this route. So, I think the more enlightened academic historians are very happy to engage in all these new ways of disseminating what the hell happened in the past, Nathen.
And of course, now you have your own history book. You have your own contribution to the genre.
My own contribution to history, and it turns out I was a bit loose with some of my facts. I mean, when I was doing the podcast, I was trying to tell a story, so I would be sort of saying, well, this happened, and then because of that, this happened. And I haven't got anyone correcting me when I do that. I mean, if I get the historian on and I mention something that I think, and then they say, no, that's not quite right. I mean, I really like that. I like that corrective, and I like an expert to say, no, this is how it really goes. But I did find when I adapted the podcast to the book, and you're actually writing it down in black and white, you can't be as free and easy with some of the facts and events. And, I had a very good a copy editor and a very good fact checker on it who would keep coming back and saying, Charlie, this isn't quite right. You're saying this happened and therefore that happened and therefore this happened. You say, well, the first thing happened and then the next thing happened 20 years later. So you couldn't say it was a direct result. So I would have to go back and kind of remake the narrative, the story side of it. And they're obviously always looking for, well, where'd you get this fact from? And sometimes it was from something that one of my guests had said, and I thought, oh yeah, that's interesting. I'll write that down. But they might not have written it down themselves. But the thing that brought it home to me was my fact checker said to me, I can't remember what the fact was. He said, Charlie, I have looked everywhere to see where you got this from, this fact. I can only find one citation for it. It's the Willie Harry Stee podcast presented by Charlie Higson. So I'd made something up. And it had therefore become in the historical record. That became a citation for it. And, again, that's really interesting as a way of looking at history, is how facts become accepted facts. And often they're not. I mean, one of the guests I had on, I really like her. She's on social media as the fake history hunter, and wrote a very good book. She's fantastic, and I follow her online because she's constantly picking up on things that people spout on social media and trying to stop this stuff becoming accepted. Her particular bugbear is everybody saying, a lot of people go on there saying, people in the Middle Ages were filthy. They never washed, they didn't have baths, and they stank. And she said, she says over and over again, this is utter bullshit. Of course, people wash themselves; they always have done. And correcting that, because often that comes hand in hand with someone saying they only learnt to wash when the Europeans came into contact with, whether it was Native Americans or North Africans or Muslims in the Middle East or whatever, and they have to say, well, no, people know how to keep themselves clean. They don't need lessons.
Yeah, I think that's a Joe Hedrick Thai
That's
visa. Apologies
Yes.
if I'm mangling my.
Well,
my
you
Dutch,
can
but,
get away with this. That's the Welsh pronunciation of her name.
but yeah,
just got a
Jo
joke.
is fantastic, and she really does get into some battles. I mean, she
Yeah.
is, she hasn't quite given up the Twitter world yet. She's there, and obviously, it's very political. A lot of the things that
Yes, totally,
that she
because
partakes in, because people have this idea of what our Western heritage is, and they
Yes.
use it to politicize their agenda. And she's there, of course, and she takes some hatred. I know that because she's retweeted me on occasion, and my God, does she have a big following? And they come for you if they don't agree with you. Hi, Nathan here. Please forgive my interruption, but I just wanted to let you know that here at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews featuring the brightest and best historians and storytellers. Authors featured have included Lucy Worsley, Ben McIntyre, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription featuring 6 issues costs just £9.99 or $9.99 for those of you across the pond. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe or to gift a subscription to friends or family. Now, back to our show. Okay, so last October, Willie Harry Stee, the book, was published by Mudlark. And of course, on the cover, we can see very prominently that you've partnered with Jim Moyer, who perhaps is better known in a previous guise as Vic Reeves.
Yes.
I believe you've known Jim for like 40 odd years. You're an old school collaborator.
Yeah, I mean,
with him.
I met him probably late 70s, early 80s. Yes, he was a friend of a friend of mine at university, so I got to know him through him. And we've worked together in various forms over the years. I used to do bits and pieces live on his show, The Big Night Out, before it was on TV, and then did some bits of it when it got on TV, and then worked with him as a script editor and a co-producer on stuff. And it's been great to have that long working relationship. He's a very special guy with a very unique worldview, and he's also a brilliant artist. So working with him was a riposte. Our partners both left us and shacked up with each other and made a fishing program, Bob Mortimer and Paul Whitehouse. So it was quite nice to get together with Jim and say, well, look, we're doing something as well. And I was very glad when he agreed to do it, because I'd been really struggling to think of who to get to do the illustrations, because I like history books that have lots of things to look at. Maps, diagrams, and illustrations or whatever. I don't like just huge blocks of unbroken text. But I wanted the book to have a certain style and a certain identity, and not just get, there's some very good illustrations out there, but I think we're all familiar with the standard sort of line drawings that you get in history books. And I thought, I don't want that. I want something more interesting, someone that can pull the book together and say, look, this is something different. And I was very pleased that Jim wanted to do it. And he's done some beautiful, very amusing illustrations of the monarchs.
Well, he certainly contributed to it. Dare I say they're eccentric, many of them, very humorous. Particularly the centre glossy pages.
Yes.
I think they're gorgeously crafted. And an inspired collaborator for you. It really helps illuminate your text. I think
Yeah.
it works perfectly together.
There is humour in it, and there is humour. Is humour in my text, and there is humour in his illustrations, his paintings, but they are also serious. I mean, he did take it seriously, and he wanted to depict the monarchs as well. Can't say as they were, but as far as we can tell. It's a good balance. He didn't go completely off the wall, and it was an interesting one publicising the book because obviously I'm known for doing comedy, and so the publishers were slightly quite hard pushing the sort of, oh, it's very funny, it's very entertaining, but I also did want to make sure actually it is historically accurate. This is a genuine history, and so I think we got the balance right on that.
Yeah, I do. And, the proof is in the pudding. The feedback has been incredible. You've got Helen Castor herself calling you a sharp-eyed historian. You've got Alice Loxton saying what a joy it is to read. You've got Al Murray, of course, another comedian and historian who has said it's the perfect refresher.
Yeah, there's a few of us.
You yourself have described the book, I think, quite accurately as a very long soap opera with crowns. And that's basically the story that you've told, isn't it? A 1,000 years with the hairstyles and the clobber might have changed across the centuries, but at the heart, it's still a scandalous, sometimes violent, often entitled behaviour that's exhibited by many of your starring cast.
It is. Yeah, it's an extraordinary story. That's what drew me to it. And it is one family. It is a family saga. You can start with William and you can follow it all the way through to Charles. Now there have been some diversions and some distant members of the families coming in on the new series, as it were. We treat it as a Netflix show, but it is. It is this dysfunctional family. And the behaviour of some of these people is extraordinary. The violence, desperate. It's what really struck me is this desperate drive to be the king or the queen, to be the monarch, and so few of them seem to have actually enjoyed it when they got into that position. It was like, well, I'm here, and now what? You have to keep fighting to hold on to it. You are not immune to disease or losing your children, being deposed. It's and you do wonder why they were so desperate, what it was that drove them. And I think there are parallels with modern politics in that. We still have the royal family, but in terms of being in power and having a major actual impact on how things go, the modern equivalent really is more the politicians. And often you look at them and you think, why were you so keen to become prime minister? Because you must have known that you were going to get nothing but grief for it. But they still do, they depose one and say, right, I'm prime minister now.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I do often wonder this with our modern politicians. Why do you want that job? You can't possibly succeed. All political lives are destined to end in failure, as the famous maxim goes.
Yes.
Except now, you're lucky if you can make a year without having, the public at your throat. It's quite interesting what you've mentioned there about, the stress and strains of medieval monarchy. But I think in your chapter on Elizabeth II, it felt like you actually sympathised with her a bit, because it seems that her life was very much a gilded prison. She lived her entire life in public. And I think you include a personal anecdote where you say that you met the Queen once at a barbecue in 2006.
Yes.
And, she couldn't even attend her own barbecue.
Yes, it was. It was a big. It was one of her birthday parties, and they did a big party in the grounds of Buckingham Palace on the theme of British children's literature, which is actually one of the things we do best in the world. And all the sort of major children's authors were there, including myself. That was one of my hats at the time. I was writing the young James Bond stories, and yes, it was full of children during the day, this party, and then in the evening everyone cleared out except for the authors and some junior royals and members of the household staff. And they had a very nice barbecue in the gardens, and I was speaking to a lady in waiting, and she said, "Oh, this is really lovely. The Queen would have loved to be here. I bet she's up there now, looking down and thinking, oh, it'd be nice to be out there." I said, "Well, why don't you just come down then and have a sausage?" And she said, "Oh, no. She had to decide, I don't know, it was about 2 years ago, whether she would actually attend the barbecue, because the security would have to be arranged. It's different if she's there, if she's not there, and they didn't have the correct security. If she suddenly wanted to change her mind, she can't change her mind. She has to agree to these things. And that is her life." And, the Queen finally understood. Well, I think actually it probably started with her grandfather, George V, but certainly George V, George VI, and in particular Queen Elizabeth. She finally really got the idea that her job is to work for us and to be a symbol of calmness and, to a certain extent, blandness. Her job is not to make a fuss and throw a weight around. And also the prime job of the royal family now is to try to keep the royal family going. And, people liked her for that, and they liked having her as a representative of the country, as the, head of state, as it were, the ceremonial head of state. And you look back through history and so many monarchs have not understood that. It's been there and it's been built in from the start, that we accept, okay, we're going to accept you as king as long as you play your part properly and hold things together and don't make our lives miserable. If things go wrong, we can get rid of you. And lots of kings have been got rid of. I don't think any queens have been deposed. Well, I suppose Matilda, who never actually made it to the throne, but it is that relationship between the monarchy and the ordinary people. And, monarchs are very good to deal with all those extremely dull state occasions and to do all those kind of formal things that they have to do, which must be bitterly boring and dull, and to meet thousands. I mean, she met thousands and thousands of people in her lifetime. I mean, she wouldn't have remembered obviously all of them. She'd only remember very few, I should imagine. So it's a difficult and interesting thing. I mean, I sort of got, I don't know, is it Stockholm syndrome or what analogy I use? Because when I set out, at the beginning of the book, I say, I am neither a Republican nor a monarchist. I don't know exactly what I do think about the royal family. But having spent 1,000 years following their story, I sort of now lean more towards being a monarchist, I think. And it's a bit like, if you watch The Godfather, the film The Godfather, you're presented with this monstrous mafia family who murder people, who are terribly corrupt, who act in an appalling manner. But by the end of the film, you are totally on their side because you've spent that time with them and you've actually been quite impressed. You've liked it when they've slaughtered their enemies. You say, yeah, go for it. And you can't, if you spend that amount of time with someone, even if you try to present them as the worst villain in the world, you will ultimately be on their side. And that's what happened to me writing the book. And I say when we get to Elizabeth and Charles and Camilla, I've met Elizabeth and I do a lot of stuff that Camilla is involved with because she's very involved in literacy charities that I'm involved in and things. And I can't do that journalistic thing of cutting myself off and saying, commenting on these people. I think, well, what if they read it, or what if their children read it? I don't want to be unpleasant about people. So I've said, I'm not, if you want to look at the scandals, here's a list of them. Go and look them up for yourself. And just trying to think what it must be like for a modern monarch is a difficult one.
I wasn't expecting a Godfather reference on this podcast, but I suppose it's very much,
Well,
le-
that is like a royal family. It's like a monarchy. He is the king, and it is about who is going to succeed him. The
leave the
same.
gun, take the corgi, maybe.
Yeah, it's the same with Succession. It's actually called Succession, and he's Roy is his surname. He is the king. And Donald Trump, is all the thing. No more kings. Donald Trump behaves very much like it's a kind of maybe a Georgian king, but it is people are fascinated with that idea of a powerful family and a powerful dynasty and the idea of succession.
Well, I mean, they gave themselves the name The Firm. They know exactly what they are. Of course, you mentioned Elizabeth, who's up there looking down upon you, enjoying your sausage rolls and wasn't able to come down. I can assure you, nobody was stopping Henry VIII or any of the other Plantagenets that came before him of coming down and enjoying their own barbecue. And that shows perhaps how well behaved Elizabeth II was. Unlike some of her ancestors who quite frankly, you describe in the book as absolute stinkers. You call King John a loser. Richard II is condemned for being bloody useless. Henry VI went bonkers, you write. And of course, Henry VIII, you call him a spoilt brat. Was there anyone that you came to appreciate or came to like?
As much as you can. I mean, the problem with the medieval monarchs is there is no record really, other than what letters someone from court may have written about. Oh, he's this type of person. Often from like foreign ambassadors and things. But there are no personal letters really. Well, there are a few that survive, and what are these people really like? We'll never know. But some of them you warm to more than others. I mean, Edward II, he could obviously be classified as a monumental loser. But a few historians have said, actually, of all the monarchs, he's the one you'd probably most enjoy going down the pub with. He liked hanging out with ordinary people and doing ordinary things. That was his problem, because people wanted him to be a proper medieval king. He didn't really want. And so, he had a sense of humour. Apparently, you would have had a laugh with him. So, I do quite like him. Whereas someone like, Henry the First had a terrible Plantagenet temper on him, and people were absolutely terrified of him during his life. And there's a story, I think it's about him, of somebody at court making a joke, or maybe it was a jester making a joke, and basically coming to a pretty horrible end. So no sense of humour, really nasty, and that was his undoing, because during his life everybody had said yes sir, whatever you say, and he said, well, my daughter Matilda will succeed me. Yes sir, of course, and nobody would question him during his time, saying, actually, is that going to work? We're not quite sure. As soon as he died, forget all that. Let's put Stephen on the throne. So yeah, I mean, some of them you do think, well, actually they were quite fun. I quite warmed to William IV, who's quite a sort of forgotten king. I described him as a bit of an amuse-bouche between the wild feasting of George IV and the heavy Victorian stodge of Queen Victoria. He seemed to be a bit of a lad. He'd been in the Navy for most of his life. He didn't like all the pomp and ceremony. He would go down to stay in the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, and he'd send his team out, said, well, we'll find out who's staying in the hotels, and if they're fun, invite them over for dinner. So he seemed like a bit of a laugh. I quite warmed to him. So yeah, there's some of them you think, oh yeah, I quite like them.
Yeah.
Do you? Well, you obviously your favourite is Henry VII.
Well, yeah, I do like Henry VII, and I think Henry VII was, my interpretation was, he was a pretty decent guy in a period where there were very ruthless and determined kings. And of course, he
Yes.
had that about him. He had to have that about him to survive. But I do think he would have been more on the fairer scale of things. But of course, he's a notorious avaricious man. People often call him a miser. He was actually avaricious. He was greedy, but he did know when to spend. But I'm not sure where he would be getting the rounds in.
Well, I don't know because from what I sort of took on board about him is that he did like collecting wealth, but he also did like spending it. I mean, he spent a lot of money on clothes and food and drink and whatever at the palace. It's not like he just put it in a locked room and would sit and count it at night, did he?
Absolutely, he was a very profligate spender. But
Well, there you are.
with Henry, it had to be for a purpose. So what propaganda value is he getting from buying around it? Maybe he's just trying to buy people's love and attention in the pub. So yeah, maybe he would get a couple of rounds in, a couple of Jaeger bombs. Who knows? I think Edward IV was another one that you pointed out could have been quite
Yeah,
a
I mean,
decent
he unfortunately went a bit kind of Henry VIII by the end. He ate too much and drank too much and ballooned a bit and became unfit, and then basically died in his 40s as a result of too much eating and drinking. But yeah, you know, he seemed to have been very much a sort of hail fellow, well met. Let me get you a pint. A bit of a Nigel Farage type, really. Come on, tell us a dirty joke. And yeah, you know, he's one of those kings that's largely forgotten now because he did die young, and you know, unfortunately, the turmoil that he had sort of put an end to in the Wars of the Roses all flared up again because he wasn't around anymore.
Which I guess brings us neatly to my favourite and your favourite, the man referred to in the mnemonic as Dick the Bard, Richard III as he's otherwise known. Is it fair he's called Dick the Bard, do you think? Maybe he should be Dick the Lad, Dick the Rad, since apparently some ascribe to him progressive parliamentary practices. Or
yeah,
maybe
I mean,
even
certainly,
Dick the Chad.
I mean, certainly before he was king, when he was kind of Lord of the North, as it were. He does seem to have had progressive policies, and you know, he was trying to push things through that would help, you know, inverted commas, the ordinary people of the country. And yes, again, he's another one of those monarchs that, you know, if he hadn't died, well, been killed young, he didn't really have much of a chance to prove what he would have been like as a king, because he wasn't king for very long. But yes, Richard III is well, obviously you've spoken about him a lot and got into a lot of trouble speaking about him because passions run high, and that's what I love about Richard III is that something that happened all this time ago, people are still getting angry about and having heated debates, and it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning about people's interest in history. There is a huge interest in history in this country. People want to know about the past and what happened and why, and you know, the likes of podcasts and all of the popular books that are being published these days all feed into that. And you know, I love the idea that people can still have a huge row about Richard III and you know, get into physical fights about it. I had to come down on one side or the other in the book. You know, was he Dick the Bad or was he Dick the Good? My feeling was that he did do the bad things, but that doesn't necessarily make him bad. He was doing them for pragmatic reasons, and he thought that's the only way to maintain security. We can't have any grey areas, and can't be constantly having these people contest it. It's going to be chaos if we put a child on the throne. Things will be much better if I'm in charge, and I can sort everything out. But he hadn't reckoned with Henry VIII. Henry VII and his mother.
Charlie, I'll tell you a story. I once gave a talk on The Princes in the Tower to a full room, and I don't know what came over me. I decided at that moment just to announce that I believe that Richard III killed those children.
Yes.
And I believe it was the right thing to do. If I was king in 1483, I would have killed those two little boys as well. And you could feel the air being sucked into the room as this historian on stage seemed to be advocating child murder. And my
But you're
point of
absolutely
trying
right.
to, yeah, the point of trying to explain was 1483, England, the last thing England needs is a child king. The previous child kings have been Henry VI and Richard II, both terrible kings who were forcibly removed and killed. Such was their poor grasp on kingship. The last thing Richard III and England needed in 1483, with the spectre of France reopening the Hundred Years' War, was a boy king. But yeah, I think I didn't quite get my my point across well.
You haven't repeated that since.
Well, I've done it now on this podcast, haven't I? and I probably
Well,
will again.
you know, that's fair. That's pretty much what I was saying as well. Yeah, it was. He took some very pragmatic decisions, and you know, if he just managed to hold on and hold off the threat, you know. Well, you know, it's interesting. He says, well, the Civil War will continue if we put a child on the throne. Everyone will be fighting each other. I'd better be in charge. He puts himself in charge, and the Civil War starts up again, and everyone's fighting each other, and he happened to be on the losing side.
He very much was damned either way what decision he took. You know, it would have been a slow burn under a Woodville faction at court. Richard, it was just a period of time before he was alienated and isolated from power. You know, he made the big, bold gambit. He learned from where his father, Richard, Duke of York, had been too slow in taking the reins of power and had ended with his head spiked upon a gateway. Richard III decided he was not going out like Dad. He was going straight for the number one seat. And of course, it was something that ultimately brought him down and ended in one of the most violent deaths that you would have written about in your book.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned before that the Fast Show. We've been on tour again. We've finished now, but I love travelling around the country and seeing a lot of it, because so many people in the UK don't travel around. They don't go to these places, and you say, oh, I've never been there. What's it like? You think, get out of town occasionally. And I did it when I was in a band in the 80s. That's the part I loved about that, was touring around and visiting these places. And we played in Leicester, and I went out for a walk around. I had the afternoon off. I was walking around town. I thought, well, I'll go and visit the cathedral. And it was only as I was approaching it, I remembered that's where Richard III is buried. So that was really exciting to go in there and to see the new. They built a very handsome, whether you call it a tomb or whatever it is, for him. It's quite moving, and you think, well, there he is. But he's also now part of. I've spot the answer. Everyone will know it. One of my favourite pub quiz questions, which is, before Queen Elizabeth II, who was the last British monarch to be buried in England?
Yes, I did come across that in the book, and I'm going to steal that. I'm going to roll that out.
It's a great one. It always goes. I do a lot of pub quizzes, and I host, and it always goes down very well. That's a good question, because it makes you think, and when you get the answer, you think, yes. And what we're talking about, how history, people are interested in it. It's all around us, and you can go to these places. And I visit these places now with a much greater understanding of the last 1,000 years. When you see some, here is the effigy of William Marshall lying in the Temple in London. And I look at it and think, well, I know who William Marshall was. And, he served under 5 kings, and what an extraordinary part of history that was. So it's, Alice Loxton is very good at doing that. She's always travelling around and posting interesting little films from wherever she's visiting. And if I can do my small part to encourage people to do that and to know what it is they're looking at, all the better.
Yeah, and I think you have played your part quite masterfully in the production of this book. I would be remiss if I just didn't mention some of my favourite takeaways from the post-Tudor period.
Yes, it can't all just be about the Tudors.
Exactly, little nuggets of information that were remarkable to come across. You mentioned the afterlife of James II, who was, of course, deposed and lived out his life in exile. After his death in 1701, you vividly tell us about how his body was cut into pieces to be gifted to those who viewed him as a Catholic hero. You know, bits were given to nunneries, bits were given to a Scottish college in Paris, other bits were given to churches. What an absurd story that I was not aware of.
Well, it is. I mean, you know, and it had been, you know, quite a common thing that when a king died, you know, his heart would be buried somewhere separate from his body, and you know, occasionally his viscera or whatever would be buried somewhere else. But yes, James went way over the top, and I didn't know about it till I was researching it. And yes, it was the flesh from his right arm was sent to some nuns, and yeah, that must have been quite a day when that package arrived. Well, yeah.
I'll tell you my single favourite line in this book.
Go on then.
It comes from your entry on Mary II, and when she was a youth, she was writing a letter to another lady, another girl that she seemed to be infatuated with, and she ended the letter by saying that she regards herself this other girl's humble trout. I mean, what a line. And I cannot see that catching on. I'm not going to text my girlfriend calling myself your humble trout.
I know. I mean, I don't know whether there was another meaning for it back then, but yeah, I mean, and these are little windows into these extraordinary things that happen in these people's lives. Where she had this incredible teenage crush on another slightly older girl, and you know, describing herself as her husband or whatever. And yes, her humble trout. No, I don't think that will catch on. Well, neither will the, you know, going back to talk about sending body parts around. What happened to Simon de Montfort, I mentioned earlier, defeated in battle, and one of the Roger Mortimers, of which there were several in history, very hard to keep up with, sent as a gift to his wife Simon de Montfort's head in a box with his testicles draped over his nose. And again, that probably won't catch on as a Valentine's gift.
Well, we don't know. The way politics is going, who knows where we'll be in 5 years' time. Yes, and of course, you've mentioned that yet another Roger Mortimer. I did feel your pain throughout the book, where you were constantly confronted with how many Henry Percys, how many Queen Eleanors. You even put into the text at one point, when discussing yet another Henry Percy, you said that this Henry Percy had a nickname as Hotspur, and you literally wrote, "Thank God." And I felt you. I really felt you when you wrote that. You know, the pain and the frustration.
Oh no! Well, there were certain times right in this book where I thought, I do not know how to tell this in a coherent way. And I mean, the other thing that is when you're dealing with all the people who are just called by their titles. So there's endless Somersets and Norfolks and Lancasters. And then you realise that sometimes historians do that because otherwise they're all called John. So you've got to differentiate one from the other. But writing about the Georges, where you've got 4 in a row, is really, really difficult, because you might be talking about when one George is on the throne and talking about their son, who's also called George, and you think, well, I can't differentiate them by calling the son George II, because at this point in their life, they weren't George II. They were just George the son. And then you might also be dealing with 3 Georges at once, and trying to differentiate who's who and when was bloody impossible.
I don't know if you're aware of this, depending on either your boxing knowledge or your penchant for using a cooking grill. But George Foreman, the former heavyweight champion of the world, he very famously named every one of his children George. He had George Jr., George III, George IV, George V, George VI, and I think he even named one of his daughters George, which must have been very interesting at family at family barbecues.
Well, I think I had heard that somewhere. It was very good to be reminded of it. But yes, I mean the naming of people in families is an extraordinary thing. My father was an accountant. He had 4 boys, me and my 3 brothers, and he named us alphabetically as a good way of keeping control of us. So it's Andrew, Barney, Charles, and Daniel. So
that is fascinating. I've never come across a family being named.
Well, it must
such a
happen
way.
quite a lot. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg has came up with some quite extraordinary names for his kids.
And so on. You obviously very famously had, back in the day, you sometimes had noble families naming their children like John and John, with the expectancy that one of those would probably not make it out of childhood. Therefore, the family name continued. I think the Pastons, who were a very famous 15th century family, they had several Johns, and historians have had to call them John the First, John the Second, John the Third, John the Fourth, to even make headway of who they are. But there we go. We'll leave the namings to the side. Charlie, Willie, Harry, Stee, your book is now available everywhere.
Yes.
In my verdict, it's humorous, it's at times irreverent, it's an excellent overview of our royal history, it's conversational, you write it in the vernacular, which makes it really accessible, but you are not scrimping at any point on the history. You can see that you have put in your work. If anyone listening wants a clear narrative of 1,000 years of kings and queens delivered in bite-sized chunks, a refresher of their school days, or even an introduction to the chaos, upheaval and drama that is British royalty, then this is the book for you. Laughing while learning is the best way, in my opinion, to devour history, and I think you've done a great job with that. So my kudos to you.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Nathen. That is an endorsement that means a lot to me. So,
thank you very much, Charlie.
My pleasure. Cheers.
Thank you all for listening today. Links, as always, are in the show notes. Please share the podcast with friends and family, and if you do want to get in touch with us, please do so through our website at aspectsofhistory.com. Until then, thank you so much for joining us.